It's fine. We'll just get started and have this conversation on the record for everyone. So good morning, everybody. Today is October the 4th. It's 10:42 a.m. We're scheduled on this work session from 10:40 to 11:40. This work session was requested by the administration to discuss cold weather shelter plans, winter homelessness strategy. So we'll go ahead and do introductions, starting with Mr. Martinez.
George Martinez.
Randy Solt.
Mark Littlefield.
Cameron Perez Verdia.
Scott Myers.
Karen Bronga.
Anna Brawley.
Christopher Constant from the administration.
Thea Agnew Benben, Special Assistant.
Farina Brown, Special Assistant.
Kimberly Rash, Anchorage Health Department.
Eva Gardner, Municipal Attorney.
So I don't know if that mic picked you up, but that's, you also have the mayor in the room, but there's plenty of the administration at the table, so we won't put her on the spot. For the purpose of our discussion, we have some members on the phone. So the goal is to turn off your mic when you're not talking so that there's no echo. Otherwise, we have a document that's put before us now. Is this document shared electronically with the clerk? Is it up on the website for the work sessions? Thank you. So for Mr. Rivera, on the website, you can download the letter, the work session page. We will, okay, and it was delivered by email. I haven't seen it yet. So with that, we'll hand this over to the administration.
Good morning, everyone. I appreciate you being with us this morning. I wanted to engage with the Assembly and just have a conversation about our winter homeless strategy and shelter services, and specifically address concerns about the non-congregate bidder. I have invited Acting Director Chris Hunter here, just simply because we are still going through the confidential process with Henning, simply because we have not executed, an award has not been laid in front of the Assembly for approval. So there are certain aspects of that that I cannot speak to. But this was just an opportunity for us to discuss the concerns with Henning operating in this particular space. We try to provide a bit of a background document that identifies how we're moving forward with emergency cold weather services, the current vendors that are available. But this is just genuinely an opportunity to create conversation, understanding that we have kind of an immediate and pressing concern to ensure that we have non-congregate services stood up for individuals that are experiencing homelessness ahead of first snowfall. We have identified in the contract that is moving forward with Henning concerns that were brought up during the investigation related to the text messaging. We currently have the third-party oversight contract. We did not have any bidders on that RFP, which gives us an opportunity to work with the Assembly and really address additional oversight and reporting activities that you would like to see from a third-party vendor that we can include in an RFP that can go back out and ensure that the Assembly's voice is heard and there's a level of oversight and engagement that is a part of an administrative process that is documented, and that we have a routine mechanism of and cadence of what that information looks like that is coming from the third-party oversight vendor back to the administration, to AHD, and to the Assembly. Additionally, we have not completed the reportables that would be included in the contract for any of our vendors, including congregate and non-congregate. This would be an opportunity for Assembly members to also engage in conversation and what type of outcomes, metrics, as well as inputs or outputs that you would like to see that ensures that we are providing the level of oversight that you would like and able to be responsive to any information that we may not have as an administration and as AHD, simply because they were not things that were included as a part of this administrative process.
All right. Any questions? Mr. Presverdia.
Just a question about process for today. You said this is just an open conversation. Are there different sections we want to talk about at different times so that we have a sense of how to engage? I have lots of questions, but I want to make sure that they're in an appropriate time period for your presentation.
We can discuss concerns about the non-congregate vendor. We cannot discuss particular details of the contract with either the non-congregate congregate or food services, simply because those contracts have not been approved by the assembly, so they are not open.
I would maybe have a slightly different take on that. We can certainly discuss those contracts. They may not be able to reveal certain details of those contracts, but we don't have to approve a contract and then learn about how the contract works. So we have to be
Yep,
really
I
clear
appreciate
about
the
that.
clarification.
Yeah, so, yeah,
So Chair, I guess to take a step back, can you give us a scope of what we're talking about for this winter? Maybe that would be a good place to start. How many people are we looking at trying to support this winter? And specifically, what are the numbers as you're projecting them in congregate, non-congregate? If you can give us a little bit of a scope of what you're expecting for this winter. Thanks.
Absolutely. So what we have initially set up and is identified in our homeless and housing strategy is that we were looking for we were looking for 500 beds because we anticipated there would be roughly 400 individuals, 350 to 400 individuals that would be unsheltered this winter. Based on feedback from the community regarding the overall cost of those contracts and updated numbers that came from the Anchorage Coalition to End Homelessness, we were able to scale back those number of beds from 500 to 400 and really look at how can we be responsive and demonstrate other opportunities to create movement in the continuum. And so we've reduced down from the initial 500 beds to 400, and we will be looking to put out an RFP for rapid rehousing later, once we get through standing up all of our emergency cold weather shelter. We will put together an RFP for rapid rehousing that will serve as an additional avenue to house individuals this winter through a rapid rehousing program that would be roughly about 12 months. So something very similar to the Next Step initiative. But in that process, I would also invite the assembly to be a part of our RFP drafting to ensure that we are including the metrics and outcomes that you would like to see, that you would like us to be accountable to. Because what is important for us is to ensure that we have a level of transparency and that we're creating choice and support across the continuum. With our congregate shelter, that is going to remain at 200.
all right. Is that your answer for now? Thank you. Ms. Brawley.
Yeah, I also have several questions, but I'll kind of start with one. Just high level, what is the thought or plan around warming center services? And by that, I mean kind of during the day, or folks who are maybe not even unsheltered, but their boiler goes out or something like that, right? I know that is a need. It's been offered in the past. It's been done better and worse, but just I don't see it on this list. So if you could speak briefly to that, and whether it would be co-located with any of these shelters, because I know that's also been an issue.
We are still actively discussing warming centers. We have a couple of locations that are still in discussion, so I don't have a level of detail for those, but we do believe that we could activate one warming center relatively quickly, but we are still working through some contractual language, and internally would that be operational.
So why don't you go ahead if you have more questions? I have like 3 as well, but I'll let you go ahead before I go.
I guess one kind of big picture question is, and again, I haven't not looked at the budget. I know there is a significant investment in shelters, so I appreciate thinking about that. We're not in the emergency mode that we were last time, but really thinking about the opportunity cost of using that much funding for things that are not housing. And I say that not because I don't think shelter is important, right? And we do it. The reality is we don't have enough housing units. We're really working hard on that. But I guess the question is, one thing we were able to do, or really the folks before me were able to do, was help purchase buildings that turned into housing. And that was a really great use of kind of one-time funds. So, and I know this isn't an either or, but I guess I'm concerned about if we spend so much money on standing up shelter, given how limited our resources are, how can we also leverage housing? So I appreciate the rapid rehousing piece, but still that is really a short-term kind of turnaround for folks. So I guess I just see it is a balance between protecting life and safety, but also making sure that we are increasing housing units. So I guess maybe if you could speak to that.
I will address that, and then I will turn it over to my partner. So- And I appreciate the optics on the large dollar amount that we are spending initially. And what I would really like to say is that we had an immediate concern in front of us that needed to be addressed financially. And understanding that that dollar amount could be better spent. And so having the two pathways for choice and support help us have data that demonstrates what were the outcomes for individuals that were in a non-congregate shelter versus those that were also onboarded into a rapid rehousing program. It also allows us to have better data in moving out RFPs next year and with what perhaps could be a cap on a per bed rate, but we would just have more information. At this point, we were really at the precipice of ensuring that we were able to stand up these services, but highly cognizant of what that expense looks like.
And
Now I have folks
sorry,
in
can
the
I
queue.
add to that, to the chair? I think the key thing that we've been really focused on and that we've been presenting to the Housing and Homelessness Committee is that we think about a bed, and it's easy to think of one bed for one person. You know, as it says in this memo, really one bed can serve many people over time if we have good flow through those systems. So we're both trying to get the initial stabilization sites available for people, but then also stand up the connections and services that will move people through into successful housing, so that as we come out of winter and are preparing for the next winter, that we're in a different situation than we are right now. We're also hoping to plan for some different types of stabilization, you know, in coming in 2025 over this period of time.
All right, so next in the queue, I have, I'll put myself, I'll wait. Mr. Rivera.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So since we're talking about non-congregate, I'll go ahead and stick on that topic. I do have a variety of questions, though. So first one on non-congregate. So I guess just going back to the beginning, the RFP that was issued out for non-congregate, was that RFP for both operators and rooms, or can you just tell me a little bit about how that RFP was constructed?
Yes, I can answer that. So kind of moving back a little bit. So in July, we know that we had the ITBs out, and those were, we stopped that process and then went into the RFP process. So for non-congregate, it does have both the operator looking for and securing the shelter locations. So both are in that one RFP. And so really looking at the RFP process and looking at how robust that process is versus the ITB, and looking at making sure that the two entities coming together to create that plan to ensure the safety and well-being of the individual staying at the facilities.
Okay, thanks for that explanation. I guess just as a follow-up on that, is there a reason why those two were combined? Because at least for the last several years, we've put out different RFPs. We've put out an RFP for rooms. We put out an RFP for operators. We put out an RFP for food. And so I remember we would always have this like a puzzle of, all right, we have to approve this contract for Alex. We have to approve this contract for another hotel. Then we have to approve this contract for the operator of that hotel. And in the end, the puzzle worked. So is there a reason why we did things a little bit differently this year?
So in 2023, there was the RFIs that went out and then the ITB. So with the ITBs, that is where there was an ability to stack those rooms because there was only so many for each of those vendors. And so that is why there was like one for the Alex, one for the Aviator, and that's how those were stacking up. With the RFP, it was, if we needed 500 beds, and then any combination of that. So if it required that the proposers come to the table with that amount already chosen. And so that when developing the RFP, making sure that there was those close connections, and that's why it was combined into one. And then knowing that we had a very short turnaround to get everything out the door so that we could stand up everything by mid-October.
Got it. If I may, Mr. Chair, I'll just ask one more question.
Sure.
Thanks. So I'm looking at the list of the individuals who the RFP submittal from Henning, they looked at Alex Hotel, Chelsea Inn, Merrifield Inn, and Henry House. I know at least one of those, I believe it's the Chelsea Inn, is being used currently for folks as sort of de facto long-term housing. So I'm wondering what the plan is, or is there a plan to help transition folks out? Are we going to be kicking folks out who are using the Chelsea Inn as long-term housing, or any of these other facilities as long-term housing? What can you expand a little on that, please?
Member Rivera, we have also received those concerns regarding individuals that were staying at specifically the Chelsea long-term, and we have reached out to Henning to work with the vendor, recognizing that it is a bit of an irony that these services are meant to provide non-congregate space for individuals experiencing homelessness and not the intent to force individuals into homelessness. With the reduction from 500 to 400, we believe that that is absolutely an avenue to ensure that individuals are not going to be displaced. But we have engaged with Henning, and I have not had a follow-up to ascertain what their what relationship they've established with the subcontractor to either mitigate that or provide other housing opportunities for those folks that are displaced.
So
Thanks. That raises more questions, but I'll wait. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
it really does. In fact, it could look like there is a contractor that's going to generate revenue by making people homelessness, right? Making people homeless. Now, I'm not going to pull any punches here. Imagine a scenario where you have a contractor who has a track record of staff that have violated civil rights, that have kind of bloodied up some of their clients, that have had reports of drug dealing by their staff, by the people working for them in the facilities that we have. So just imagine that were true. And then you have a scenario where the municipality has contracted with them not only to provide the services, but also to secure the rooms. So what do we do when we need to fire the contractor because they can't change their stripes? They just continue to be who they are. And yet they hold the rooms under contract. And so we can't simply say, we're going with a new vendor because we don't have site control. If we don't have site control, then we're over a barrel, and we just have to kind of choose to continue with the abuser until such a time as we've come up with a new operator. How are we going to manage if we find ourselves in a position where the contractor is unable to ethically and humanely provide these services?
Chair Constant, thank you for the question. It is absolutely fair and reasonable given the concerns with the vendor. And I do want to acknowledge that they are both the vendor and they hold the lease. They would be the subcontractor for the facilities. In any situation where we would have concerns with that vendor, we would start with the normal administrative process and ensuring that we are documenting to first correct whatever behavior that we are seeing. And then we would go through a notice to cure. And then we would go through an immediate RFP process to find a new vendor and to create subcontracts with those particular locations. I would love to give a much more fulfilling answer that we could just immediately exit a contract with that vendor, but we would have to go through the administrative process and hoping that we would be able to course correct through documentation, letters to cure. Also recognizing that if we were in an unfortunate event where that there was an immediate need to quit, we would then go through a shorter process working with purchasing to ensure that we could stand up services with an alternate contractor and or engaging with the hotels that we currently have the facilities engaged with.
I think that that argues for a separation of the contracts for the rooms versus the actual services, because if we find ourselves in a terrible place with a contractor and they have the contracts for those locations, then we are powerless to change because they have the control. And so I can't imagine a scenario where it's in the best interest of the municipality to engage in this kind of a structure of a contract, even if it's crisis, short term, we got to get this done, because we find we're literally handing them the ability for us to manage crisis over time. They would be holding the keys. So I have a lot of concerns about that. So another question I have is, are we changing the amount if we're reducing to 400 to make sure that it's commensurate?
That is correct.
So
The document in front of you is the initial contract award at the 500 amount.
right, and so it'll be reduced at some point. So when we see some final item, can we phase in capacity? We heard from Ms. Agnew that we are able to kind of start to do this work, that we recognize that we don't need X number of beds because each bed can be used multiple times if we are efficient about how this system works. And the second part of that question is the contract based on a fixed price or on utilization? Because if we don't have people in those beds and we're paying $125 a day for an empty bed, I feel like we're getting taken advantage of. And so what's the process for utilization? So it's two parts. Can we phase in capacity, and how are we paying for it?
Chair Constant, thank you. We could phase in capacity. That is something that we would just work with with purchasing and the vendor, as well as to your question around bed utilization. It is a fixed price at this time.
So essentially, whether or not those beds are filled, whether or not this operator does an assertive effort to get folks in there, whether or not the need is actually there, we're on for $125 a day per bed until such a time as the contract is expired.
As the contract is currently written, that is correct.
Okay, and I have a couple more, but there's a number of people in the queue, so I'll step out and we'll kind of circle through. Next, I have Mr. Salt.
Thank you. Couple questions. So one, just pointing out, maybe you can speak to, there seems to be a minimal delta between the two shelters as far as, I just took the figure you have divided by the number of beds for duration, it's $400. So what's the difference in what I'm getting for each? It sounds like one I'm getting a congregate, one I'm getting a room. So it sounds like I'm getting a better deal on the second one. Next, if you could recap what is provided, what are we providing? Beds, rides, transportation. I see we still have the meal RFP that's coming out, so that to be an additional cost. Be interesting to see what that runs into roughly. And then last question is, are we getting anything in return? What are we requiring of the clients? Drug-free, alcohol-free, they have to seek services, they have to be looking for employment, anything like that we're asking for. Thanks.
On your first point, that we definitely analyzed the cost from the previous year and the number of beds and found the same finding. And we're quite, interested in that non-congregate and congregate beds have a similar cost. I think part of what you have to consider there is when you run a congregate shelter, you have to have 24/7 staffing, and there is a staffing ratio that's required in the contract. So that has a pretty high fixed cost compared to someone who's in a non-congregate setting where they, have someone checking in on them, but we're not paying for that level of oversight. So I think that explains some of the difference. I think that does speak to Member Brawley's question about how could we best use these funds? And we're all over that and very interested in figuring that out for the coming, not for right now, but for the coming year. We're, as Farina said, we're really kind of trying to get this stood up so that we can also address the issues that we're seeing in the community related to people who are unsheltered. We're getting a lot of concerns, obviously, and, you know, as the municipality does abatement, there's also the concern of where are people going? Are they just moving around? So there's a real need to get these services stood up so that we do have a place where people can go and start to stabilize, start to engage, and start to move into employment, healthcare, housing, other types of stability, which simply is very difficult to do when someone doesn't have an address, doesn't have their ID, all the things that you know about. So that's our immediate interest. Can you remind me of your other two questions?
The other one was,
Oh, okay, Farina can take the other
Yeah,
two. She's got it.
There's also an additional difference between congregate and non-congregate. Congregate costs are a little bit higher because they include the damages of the units itself within the cost.
Thank you, Member Salt. And to your question, there's also the need to ensure that there's linkage happening in our non-congregate space. So that's where you see rides. That's critically important. And what you'll find with individuals that are experiencing homelessness is that, sure, we'll make a referral for you, but how do you get to that appointment? What is the return on investment? Individuals that are going into our non-congregate are required to engage with an intake specialist, a housing specialist, and case management. Right now, we have not completed the required reportables by the vendor that will ultimately be selected, because this is our opportunity to really identify what are those outcomes that we expect to see. This also speaks to why we are trying to move forward in a parallel process, rapid rehousing, so that we can demonstrate what is the delta between engaging in a rapid rehousing with intensive support and a non-congregate shelter with what is currently identified as an intake housing specialist in case management. We know that it requires multiple contacts for some people to engage. And even though emergency cold weather is 6.5 months, it may take 4 months before someone says, I'm ready for linkage. And now they're being stepped down into hopefully another housing situation, or unfortunately back onto the street. And so you just don't have that follow-up. In a rapid rehousing program, you have 12 months that really creates an opportunity for that intensive engagement. So return on investment is something that we also are highly interested in, so that we can bring forward the best use of dollars based on what those outcomes look like for both non-congregate shelter services, rapid rehousing, another choice and support that we look to build throughout the winter.
Did I hear correctly that the contract that they're being offered, they are going to cover transportation
There's funding that's included for bus passes.
in the $125 a day? Thank you. Next in the queue, I have Mr. Martinez.
Thank you, Chair. The question I have is just with respect to oversight and the concerns that the chair raised, for example, with respect to bad activities, bad acting. The chair described some things that he mentioned drug dealing. And so I don't know any of that. But what I'm asking is, when we do hear a report, what is the difference between a rumor and a report? And what is the difference between how we track that, we've run those things down? And does that impact at all the ability for a person to bid on the contracts, or an organization to bid on those contracts? So how do we run those concerns down?
Member Martinez, thank you for the question. It is often difficult to run down the difference between what is just gossip and when there's actual negative activity that's happening in either a congregate or non-congregate shelter. What has been put into place in the current contract specific to some of the concerns that were identified with this vendor previously were 3 very specific measures that I do not have in front of me. Do you have those? AIM?
Those were focused around behavior, politicking, and weapons on site. Making sure that none of that, the first 2 don't occur, and then that we are serving our community with the best engagement that we can.
In that particular instance, where And what I said in the very beginning of this meeting is ensuring that we are documenting. The only way that a vendor would be ineligible is that if we've gone through all of the administrative process, which is documenting occurrences of behavior that are outside of what is in the contract, documenting through our third-party oversight entity that will have more engagement, daily reporting logs to AHD, the administration, and reports to the assembly that we would routinely engage in, as well as increased activity from our AHD staff to actually go on site to the different facilities so that we're just eyes on. And that when you have that just kind of drop-in engagement, you're catching people in how they naturally respond versus putting on kind of a show when they know the administration is coming or someone from the department will be there. So to answer your question, the black and white processes, ensuring that we have all of the items that you cannot do, the behaviors and responsibilities of a vendor, and those are identified in the contract as well as a part of the client rights, which the vendor would be held to if a client is intimidated, if a client feels fearful, if a client has been assaulted. Those would all be complaints that would be reportable back to AHD through the third-party vendor that we would then be able to document and act on.
So just separate from those reports that go through the Department of Health and that process that you described, and thank you for your answer. How do we work with police reports? Similarly, do they count? Do they matter? Is there a relationship between an investigatory process of the APD that flags something that would otherwise be problematic for a contract? And what is the nexus between those? If you could.
I will answer this and then I will look to Ms. Gardner. Any documentation of wrongdoing by a vendor, we would accept that information and investigate.
Thank you. So it might be helpful to reference the code in answering this question, specifically AMC 720.030, which is the provision, the section that provides that an award can only be made to a responsible bidder. And in there, it outlines, essentially in the decision to award process, what you can consider. And it has a list of factors. You can consider the bidder's record of honesty and integrity, capacity to perform, past performance. And in those factors, that's where that question could come in that initial, are you talking about in the initial decision to award or not award, Member Martinez?
And to also maintain, contract relationships, right?
Okay, so
Yeah.
ongoing. So I think there's the initial decision to award or not award, which involves an assessment of whether the bidder is responsible, and then, is along the way, the contract performance. I'll talk about the first one and then the second one. So when you're making in the decision to award process, you can consider whether the bidder is responsible or not. And you could take into account whatever information you want. However, if you determine that the bidder is not responsible, then the bidder has the ability to challenge that through an appeal, and that's provided in code as well. And then at that point, it goes before the bidding review board. And then you would need to make sure that whatever you're relying on is something you can present to that board, that it's evidence. And so that's where rumor, probably not enough. So you need to be able to defend that. Police reports, those are reports of, that's not an adjudicated fact that happened. Maybe if there are enough of them, that would kind of tip the balance into, well, maybe something's going on here, but on their own, they wouldn't be enough. So I think it would depend on the type of evidence, the volume of evidence, the quality of the evidence at that initial stage, and whether you think you could defend it in front of the bidding review board. And then along the way, for contract performance, I think then you look at, again, same weight, quality, quantity of evidence, and look at the contract terms and consider whether or not they're being violated. At that point, you would have you could make assertions or claims for breach of contract, and you could use that to require remedial action or to terminate the contract if you wanted. Is that enough of an answer? Would you like more? Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Brisverdia.
Okay, let me just, I'll hit, I think, 3 areas. Just going back to the Henning conversation briefly, I think we're sort of talking around a lot of things here. Have you met with them, and do you feel confident that they are prepared to take on this role? And have you discussed some of these challenges that they've had in the past?
I have met with Henning and we have not discussed the challenges in the past. Do I currently feel that they are capable of taking on the challenge? Based on their proposal, they have identified that they are capable of that. In my engagements and interactions with Henning, which have been limited, they have been professional and there's been nothing that would lead me to be concerned based on those interactions, which have been facilitating and hosting tours of both the 56th Avenue Shelter, Golden Lion, and then engagements around my role in abatement action, as well as their engagement in our behavioral health work sessions as a representative of a service provider in the community.
Okay. Second, I'm going to try not go too big picture in this, but I'll get to the question. I'm remembering, 6 years ago, the difference between the investment that this municipality made in homelessness compared to today, and how this process was so different. We would go and talk to Beans and have a contract and beg them to take the contract, and they would reluctantly say yes because there was no one else who would do it, and we would sign a contract with them, and then we would essentially step away and let them run what happens during winter. We're in a different place. COVID happened. There's a lot more money. There's a lot of new tax structure, all kinds of things. What I'm trying to figure out is we are in a much bigger position now as it relates to all of this. And I'm wondering where the community partners are, where they are in terms of their role in winter shelter, winter services, all the services that historically really were the nonprofit organizations that stepped up during the winter to really provide the kind of services that we needed as a city, because the city wasn't able to do it. And I guess I'm both concerned in the long term, which is a different conversation, about what does this look like 5 years from now, 10 years from now, and where are we going with this? But I'm more interested in your thoughts about this year and whether those conversations have happened, and if the organizations who've historically stepped up during this time are stepping back because we have stepped into it, or is the need greater? Where are they in this conversation, and are they at the table with you in talking about how we're going to provide services for this winter?
Thanks for the question. So I think it's a great question. Again, we don't need to rehash ancient history, but I do want to remind us that when we were doing it that way, when we were asking Beans to open up for the evening, that led to a very, very difficult and unmanaged situation at Third Avenue that, the municipality worked on, developed a plan that was going to be implemented, and then hello, COVID. So we're still reeling from that problem that we weren't able to solve then, plus some compounding issues today, such as the fentanyl epidemic and the impacts of COVID, which are so complicated. So it's absolutely true the municipality is taking a bigger role than it has in the past. When we look at the housing inventory count for Anchorage, the nonprofits are actually providing 1,000+ beds of emergency shelter and transitional housing year round. So all of those folks, Covenant House, Beans, Claire House, all the people, they're doing it still. And we have the situation that we're experiencing here in Anchorage, which is we have, again, we've been making headway. Those numbers, according to our data, the coalition's data are going down. So we have fewer people unsheltered this winter than last. Does it feel that way? Not really. It feels like there's a lot of people unsheltered. So with this administration, with Mayor LaFrance's plan and priorities, I think where we're at is we want to make significant change on this. And that does take an investment, again, to help people who are currently unsheltered have a location where they can start that stabilization process, start that engagement with employment, healthcare, housing that will lead to fewer people being outside. And again, yes, it's a big role. I think we would love to see that money spent, as efficiently as possible. Is that our current, range of options? Maybe not. I mean, I think Member Salt brings up some really good points that we are absolutely interested in investigating as we go through the winter. But the other thing that Farina mentioned is we have already been convening a behavioral health provider work group, because we know that one of the main reasons that people remain unsheltered or that they're not able to succeed in housing is because of unmet health needs due to behavioral health issues. And so we are absolutely top priority getting a very kind of progression of engagement with our partners at all the different steps in that all the pathways that you need to go through to get into behavioral health care, to be engaged at shelter locations with people who are unsheltered through our outreach partners. So I think the short answer, which is not what the one I've given, is yes, they are doing it and we want to engage with them more. Yeah.
Ms. Branca.
Thanks. I feel like, and you may have touched on how you're going to do this, but I feel like the biggest thing that I hear from my constituents is they're not seeing that there's progress. Like you say, that we believe there is progress and we believe there's less unsheltered, but it would be really nice with whatever data in the HMIS system that the people that we sheltered last winter, how many of those people are now standing on their own 2 feet, with whatever vouchers, or they're no longer being funded by the municipality of Anchorage for housing? How many of them have entered some sort of employment? How many of them have are in some sort of counseling or drug treatment program? I feel like if there was some really transparent metrics of what the people we housed last winter, where are they now? And I feel like that snapshot's possible, but I don't know how. But I also was just rolling around in my head. So I think Mr. Salt was doing the math too, but like 3,000 a month per person, is that what you're thinking? And the bus passes, food, that's a separate contract. So did you say food was in this price as well?
Food is included in our congregate. There's a separate cost for non-congregate.
Thanks. And then
I'm sorry,
Oh, go ahead.
I apologize. The food contract would include for both congregate and non-congregate, so it's a separate expense.
And probably about $10 a day is what we were looking at last year, maybe. I don't know. I'm trying to think.
We are still in the negotiation process.
And then you may or may not be able to answer this question, but are we in litigation as to the first round of trying to find an operator for the shelter? Someone told me they were going to be engaging in litigation because of the first round.
Was there a bidding review filed?
We're not aware of any.
And Member Bronga, thank you for the data request. That is something that we will take back. I think it's an excellent, where are they now, to give a snapshot of how effective have we been. And it also provides a baseline for how we move forward.
All right, Ms. Barley.
Yeah, thanks. I'm going to make a comment and then I do have a question. On the point about the contractor, I'm going to echo some of the concerns that Mr. Constant said. I looked back at the July investigation, and I want to be clear that there is the text message issue, and then there's everything that happened before that, some of which I was aware of because we were emailed about it as assembly members, some of which I was sort of aware of as a member of the public. So I don't want to characterize the issue as just that, because that is really the latest thing that happened, not the only thing that happened. And the report that your administration issued in July says that there was an investigation that was done. There were shortcomings to that report, obviously, but that there was still a finding that this contractor and another individual, and I'm quoting, acted in a manner that failed to honor the public trust. And then the reasoning given in this investigation is that this particular contractor was not going to pursue additional contracts. So I think there just needs to be better explanation and a better rationale for why 3 months later, the same administration is saying something different. So I'm just saying that. And I've communicated that to you guys before this meeting as well. But my question is actually, so I do think that non-congregate shelter and using hotel rooms is a really great thing. And that's why we pushed for it last year. I know some of the public feels that we're saying, oh, we're just giving people hotels, but really what it is it gives you a door that you can lock so that you're safe. And we did see better outcomes from that. So I don't think it's a bad idea. I don't think it's a waste of money. And I think it sounds like it's actually lower cost generally. And one example that we can give is there was a person who has testified at many of our meetings over the last year, and they literally went from Cuddy Park to the Alex over the winter and are now stably housed and working. So, I mean, that's just one example, and they were able to come to our meetings. So hopefully folks remember who that is. So there are success stories out there. But my concern is, Mr. Perez-Verdia and I multiple times have heard from our constituents in Spenard that the Chelsea Inn is a site with a lot of problems. And it's not even necessarily folks experiencing homelessness, but it is drug activity and it is other, I guess, illegal activities happening in hotel rooms. And so my concern about the Chelsea, and I say that because I do support using the Alex, I support using these hotels, but the Chelsea Inn has a bad track record, has for years. And I'm worried that if we're using especially part of those rooms for shelter, that it's not going to set anybody up in that building for success. So I just want to put that on the record, but I wonder if you could comment on, and just generally the use of that many different facilities. I understand the idea of scattered site, but I'm worried about that it will not be able to be managed very well. So those are just my concerns. So I wonder if you have any response as far as the Chelsea in particular.
Thank you, Member Brawley. You are correct in that we are trying very hard to ensure that we have scatter site. Specifically with the Chelsea Inn, that is something that we will go back and discuss with the vendor. I do also want to say that we are reducing the number of rooms needed from 500 to 400. So we do expect a reduction in some of the locations that were initially identified in the proposal. And so we will include that as a part of our conversation.
So we have about 10 minutes left. A few people in the queue, Mr. Rivera, Mr. Salt, myself. Mr. Rivera.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. So I'll go ahead and I have a few requests to make that I'll just go through quickly, an explanation of why I'm asking these things, and then I'll end it at that. I'm happy to get a response from the administration. What I'll do is I'll email my other questions because I do have some additional questions to the team, of the administration team. So first is, and this is all sticking with the non-congregate piece. So first is, if I heard correctly, and maybe I just misheard, Henning will be using a variety of subcontractors. I don't know if those subcontractors are just the Alex Hotel, the Chelsea Inn, or if there are an additional layer of subcontractors that Henning is planning on using. If there is, I would like a full list of all of those subcontractors that Henning is planning on using and for what purpose. It would be good to get a breakdown of rooms per location, sort of similar to what Member Brawley was saying. You know, I'd like to know, are we talking about 100 rooms at the Alex and then 20 rooms at the Henry House, or sort of what's that breakdown going to look like? And then speaking of breakdowns, it would be very helpful for me to get a cost breakdown, because when I look at this $9 million figure, it's just seems to me like a really large dollar figure. And I would be very curious to get a better understanding of the operations expenses versus the room lease expenses. And then it would be just helpful overall if we could just put all of the various expenses, so whether that's transportation, food, operations, room leases, or in the terms of the congregate, the rental costs, or whatever that agreement is with SWS, just so that we can get a more full picture of how this emergency winter shelter season is going to cost, so that we can compare it more accurately to prior years' emergency winter shelter. Because if anything, our winter shelter costs should be going down. And I don't feel like this winter shelter season, the cost is going down. I feel like it's either equal to or more expensive than last year's winter shelter cost. And maybe I'm wrong in that feeling and that assumption, but just looking at these dollar figures, that's what it feels like to me. And then I would like to know who the other bidder was. So there's two bidders, who that other bidder was and what that specific dollar amount was in their proposal. And the whole reason for this, and I'm going to agree with some of the things that members Constant and Brawley said. Here we have an operator that I frankly do not trust for providing congregate or non-congregate shelter. And I made it very clear the last time that that we had this whole debate is that I can trust Henning to do housing, but we should not work with them anymore for congregate or non-congregate spaces for shelter. And I'm really worried about serious harm to our clients and reputation to the municipality, frankly. So I think there is going to be a lot of extreme scrutiny on this if this contract does pass. And frankly, I think part of that is because, speaking for myself, I mean, I had a little bit of a jaw-dropping moment when I heard that Henning was going to be the contractor, because my assumptions were that we would no longer be working with them. But here we are again. So yes, please, if you can get all that information, plus all the other information, I'm going to email you so that we can get a more full picture. Thank you.
Thank you, Member Rivera. I can address your question about subcontractors. Henning is subcontracting with the locations identified. They are not subcontracting any services. And the rest of the information, we will follow back up with you in writing.
Is that good? Mr. Rivera?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Next, I have Mr. Salt.
Thank you. Hopefully, you'll understand this question. So I have constituents that ask, who would want to be homeless in Anchorage? And my response is kind of terse, but it's, hey, we're offering them a hotel room, 3 meals a day. Who wouldn't want to be? Do you have disincentives in place to prevent people from taking advantage of us? Not that saying there's a large population doing that, but I imagine there could be some.
Member Salt, thank you for the question. I do just very quickly want to caveat for Mr. Rivera that we will pass on the breakout cost once we are through the confidential negotiation process. And now to your question, are there disincentives? We really aren't looking to create barriers, challenges, or disincentives, because we want people to engage in these services so that, as Member Brawley, identified, that it really does create a safe place to be and allow people to start to think about other options. How do they move from where they are, which sometimes is at the lowest point when you're experiencing homelessness and the level of trauma that you've experienced and that continues to be ongoing even when you have somewhere safe to be. We want them to come inside. We want them to engage in these services. And so, no, we do not have built-in disincentives. What we do have is follow-up from our vendors who are engaging with individuals to link them. And if there are, and there's language in the contract that really helping to try to move people who may be in active addiction and helping them link to services, but disincentivizing someone coming through the door would kind of defeat the purpose of trying to make these pathways available.
The other aspect of that is that the way that the rooms, not so much at congregate shelter, but the non-congregate, the way the rooms and beds are allocated is using the coordinated entry list along with the coalition. So the coordinated entry list, the purpose of it is to prioritize people who have the highest levels of vulnerability. And so that will be one of the factors that's used to determine who goes into congregate and non-congregate shelter.
Good. Thank you. That's kind of what I was looking for. Appreciate it.
That actually leads to my question. I'm in the queue. I have a few, but just a couple minutes. Is the access to shelter, the plan for that in the contract, that they will use the coordinated entry list because they were supposed to use the coordinated entry list last year, but they didn't. And instead what they did was they high graded and chose the clients that they wanted to move from their shelter to their housing units to wherever it was most profitable for them, or at least that's how it was explained to me. And so if it's not in the contract, I believe it will not happen. So any assumption better be in writing if you want it to effectively be in place, or at least to be lettered into existence when it is proven not to exist. So I would ask that you make sure that that's in. That was one of the questions I had on my list. Then the reality, I'm strongly supportive of the congregate shelter proposal. It makes sense. It's affordable. It's in the scale that we've been dealing with over the last years. Everything seems reasonable. Obviously, for a number of reasons, there are many concerns relating to the non-congregate. We are approximating the cost of a day in a DOC facility at a daily rate, all in. And so that can't be right. Correction beds are the second most expensive beds that are supposed to exist in our system, second only to an API, structured, locked in hospital. And so we have a problem from a cost basis that something's happening here that doesn't make sense. Mr. Rivera is right. His sense that things have gone up, I think from a daily rate, it's a 25% at least increase over last year. And so there's nothing that would justify that other than something within the details of the offering that has to be really closely inspected, because our job here is not to create a very profitable corporation, that's standing up, because again, they have potentially now housing, they have shelter, congregate in several locations, and the flexible ability to move people wherever they want. That sounds like a recipe for self-dealing. And we have to put some controls on this to ensure that we don't incentivize that kind of abuse, because money is a very strong motivator. I think that there are a lot of questions. I may ask the members to support the idea of delaying the non-congregate shelter to a special meeting on the 15th, because I would like it introduced immediately. The public hasn't had a chance to see any of this. This conversation laid on the table wouldn't be really fair for us to receive in a day, on the same day, then be asked to vote on the specific facts. I think if we do move to a special meeting on the 15th, then there's still time to get the contract signed and services started by the 20th or so, which is in kind of line with the strategy should the items be prioritized. And I'm told that there are 3 late on the table items coming for the meeting on Tuesday. And again, I think it's probably wise to get them on the table, not withhold them so we're still waiting. Otherwise, we find ourselves in the same position. We need a few more days. And so with that, if there's no other questions, Karen.
Just real briefly, I had someone last year ask why we don't have signs up on some of the major corners where we do see a lot of panhandling of how to connect with the shelter. I know there's been a lot of outreach, but I think there is some gaps with people who have not interacted with any operators yet. And the other thing, I was thinking back to Mr. Constant talking about the capacity, and they get paid by how many beds are full. The only, I like the idea that you only pay for how many beds are full, but then it kind of also disincentivizes moving people forward. So that's a fine line. Just was thinking that, so.
Say though, that the problem about disincentivizing moving people forward, we don't have that ability if all of that is in the hands of the contractor, right? And so that's the dilemma. And if it were possible, it's probably not possible, but some mixed offering where you have a firm fixed amount that covers a baseline and then a utilization rate for a certain percentage above that line would be more rational than simply writing them a check for X number of beds for that may or may not get used. And so there's, again, time is short, but Kim.
I also want to bring to the attention that also on Tuesday, one of the items will also be the requesting the extension of the 200 capacity at East 56. It does expire on the 15th.
So then would that be 4 items? The food, the extension, and the congregate and the non-congregate?
Correct, yes.
So no surprises there. So everybody knows. Anything else? Thank you. These are tough conversations. Yeah.
Thank you. I appreciate your time.
We'll be back on the record in 10 minutes.